Halito. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're calling from today. Thank you so much for joining us for the National Congress of American Indians Tribal Disaster Preparedness webinar series. This is the first of a three-part webinar series that we are excited to offer all of you. And the title of the webinar series is Exploring the Tribal Disaster Declaration Process, How to Access Emergency Resources When Your Tribal Nation Needs It Most. And as I said, it's part one of three. We have a fantastic lineup for you today of speakers that have a lot of fantastic information and on-the-ground experience regarding accessing FEMA resources through tribal declarations and also navigating the tribal declaration pilot guidance. We know that this has been a very important topic as tribal nations have been trying to access resources through this time of COVID-19 and before COVID-19 when natural disasters struck Indian country. So with that all being said, we're going to kick off the presentation with a couple of housekeeping announcements on how Q&A will work, how we're going to gather information, and then we'll start turning it over to our panelists. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Naomi from the National Congress of American Indians events team to lay out our housekeeping announcements. Naomi?
Hi, thank you so much, Kelby. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our Tribal Disaster Preparedness webinar, part one. Before we get started, let's go over basic housekeeping items for our webinar today. First, we'll go over question and answer. During the program today, we'll be stopping at various points so that you can open the floor to questions. However, until we reach these points in our agenda, all microphones will remain muted except for the panelists. Please also make sure your cameras are turned off during today's presentation to allow only the speaker panelists to be seen on camera. What we'd like to do for these intermediate question and answer portions is add the questions to the chat. We'll be extracting these questions from the chat and adding them to a list of questions. And then Robert will read the questions to the panelists as we go. For the question and answer at the end, however, we will allow you to do hand raises, and the hand raise portion is at the bottom of the screen as well. So we'll drop these instructions in the chat. So again, when we're doing the intermediate questions, please use the chat. When we get to the Q&A section at the end, we reserved 30 minutes for that. You can use the chat box or you can raise your hand. And when you are called upon to have your question answered at the end, there are two ways to unmute your microphone. If you're calling from a cell phone, you'll need to dial *6 to be connected by the phone. Or if you are calling from your computer, you'll just need to click the microphone button at the bottom of the panel. Again, don't worry, we'll put this information in the chat box for you to reference. Next, if you're experiencing any technical issues at any time throughout the presentation, please reach out to us in the chat box. We'll respond through the private message to get your issues resolved. Outside of the designated Q&A section during the presentation, questions and comments should be submitted through the chat box. We'll pause to answer any questions and add comments momentarily after they're submitted. Thank you for your patience in listening to these instructions. I believe we can go ahead and get started. I'll now turn the floor over to Robert Holden for our welcome.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Robert Holden, Choctaw, Chickasaw. At this point, before we go any further, ask my good friend, colleague, Honorable Joe Garcia, if he will do an invocation for us. Joe Garcia has been a governor, councilman, and involved as a spiritual leader with his pueblo forever. He's also been served as the National Congress of American Indians president, vice president, and on the board for decades. He's a great statesman, and it's my privilege to introduce Joe Garcia.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everyone. Please allow me, and I'm honored to have been asked to give a greeting and a blessing this morning. I think it is proper to move in that direction, so I will do so in my native language, and then I'll do a translation, a brief translation. Ambana heading counter, no kai hui count them all. Ambano answer rimpori, ambana wing rimpui to Namori. Ambakwan in the moa, stone in the moa. Nambi Nambi unge hoe ain mari. No ma damito satari mufin satari popi. Ambano body say wampuari. Ombe wo have it and the rinconi and by the bopin tayari mani into Namorano. The Veda, so that are moving that are coping and no way to the coni, way to tamper the coni, way to compare. O Palma Core, Nante Duri Pony, Nuni Coco Hardy Mani, no Uncuari, Bishop Baveri, we were saying Waviani, and Bano Iku, Watori, Machanki, Pundi, around no Unku, Punda Wahanu, and the Mary. With all due respect, ladies and gentlemen, tribal leaders, staff, friends, partners, colleagues. I call upon the Creator today that we should start off in a good way. This is the first session that we're having of this disaster information, but the tribes have long been partners in the endeavors that we have taken over, all for the purpose of protecting our children, protecting our land bases, protecting our people. But we call upon the Great Spirit to be here with us today, to help us move the issues of Indian country forward. This is but one of them. But we need to be safe. But we also need to work in a smart way. That smart way has been taught to us by our ancestors. To work together, to stay united, to be respectful, and never forget the spiritual side of our being. That we always invoke the spirit of our ancestors to be here with us today and every day to meet the challenges, and that we will be successful. But we thank all of you for being online. We thank the presenters, and we thank all the people that have allowed you to be online, and that we will be successful today. We'll do again tomorrow, and then there'll be a third one coming up. But let's continue to work together. You stay safe, and may the power of our Creator and the spirits of our ancestors be with you and keep you safe. So, with all of that, the meeting is now open. So, speak your heart, speak your mind, speak your soul. Have a good day. Sindawa. Thank you very much. So, the meeting is now open, Robert. Back to you.
Thank you, Honorable Joe Garcia. Again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Kelby and Naomi, for your remarks. And I'm tribal liaison for the University of Louisiana State National Center for Biomedical Research and Training at the Academy of Counterterrorist Education. I'll be your moderator today for this webinar of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Tribal Disaster Declarations Pilot Guidance. I want to thank the National Congress of American Indians for sponsoring this production. The NCAI, working with tribal leaders, was successful in 2013 in amending the Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act that authorized tribal governments the option to directly request a presidential emergency or major disaster declaration. FEMA published the Tribal Declarations Pilot Guidance in January 2017 as a resource to tribes seeking to exercise tribal sovereignty throughout the declaration decision-making process. The NCAI is pleased to offer a webinar series beginning today for tribal officials, presented by tribal officials in a dialogue format about their experiences regarding requirements, as well as the considerations and cost effectiveness in managing a tribal direct disaster declaration. By the way, if you're not familiar with the guidance document, according to the General Accounting Office, the purpose of an agency to issue a guidance document is to explain new regulations, respond to stakeholder questions, and clarify existing policies and procedures. A guidance document may explain how regulations are interpreted by the agency, and until finalized, it's not a legally binding document. This administrative guidance comes under the category of advice and recommendations. Without further delay, I want to introduce the stellar lineup of speakers with us today. We have Jeff Hanson, Nelson Andrews Jr., Theresa Greger, David Monroe, Norma Reyes. And Jeff, if you would please begin, tell us a little bit about yourself. Thank you.
Halito, my name is Jeff Hanson. I am the Director of Community Protection for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Under that role, I serve as the manager for the Emergency Management Program, the Office of the Fire Marshal, and the Probation Program. Prior to coming to the nation, coming back home to the nation, I was a Air Force firefighter for 10 years. And have spent most of my adult life working in the public service sector. Emergency management was always the end goal, but I sped my career goals up a little bit and came into emergency management a little early. To me, this is one of the most important roles that we have as tribes is to take the measures and do the things to protect and prepare our citizens so that they can recover faster and be ready for disaster events. So it's always been a goal of mine is to better prepare individuals and Indian country to be a huge asset to each other during disaster events. On another area where I work, I am also serving as the vice chair of the National Advisory Council for FEMA. In that role, I'm serving in the non-elected tribal representative position and have been honored to be a member of that group now for 7 years, working to address policy issues with FEMA and how we might go about bringing about better change for not only the nation, but more specifically in my role, the issues in Indian country. So I appreciate everyone being here and I look forward to the conversation and hopefully we'll be able to give you some of our experience that will help you and your nations be better prepared for the next disaster. Thank you.
Nelson?
Yes. Wanikisak, Katapatish for your time. Good day and thank you. My name is Nelson Andrews Jr. I am the Emergency Management Director for the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Nation. We're located on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I also serve in the role as Interim Tribal Administrator for our tribal nation, and I'm also a member of our tribe. Prior to my role as Emergency Management Director for the tribe, I worked for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for close to 12 years. I was a logistics section chief within the region and also the support branch director for the National Incident Management Assistance Team. I was also a graduate of the National Advanced Academy as the 4th tribal nation representative to go through that school. We have been in process with our emergency management department now for 6 years. We've been able to bring in approximately close to $4 million in grant funding, federal and state. We basically have to write all our own grants, and we'll get into that during the presentation of what it takes, to operate a tribal emergency management department as well. Yeah, so I'm honored to be here and look forward to sharing some more insight from our experiences and all of our knowledge. So, Katapatish, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff and Nelson. And Theresa?
Alka Mamayut Temenue Makupai Elshkwanan. Hello, my name is Dr. Theresa Greger. I'm from the Ipai Nation of Santa Isabel. I'm calling in today from the homelands of the Payam-Cowichan people at Washwayom Pomki in northern San Diego County. I just want to acknowledge all of the traditional territories and ancestral lands that everyone is calling in from today, especially along the lines that Joe Garcia mentioned in the invocation to call forth our ancestors and help us absorb all this knowledge and keep expanding our networks to protect our homelands. I've worked for the Intertribal Long-Term Recovery Foundation. We're a tribal nonprofit that formed in 2007, and I've worked for it since day one because we experienced a series of catastrophic wildfires in San Diego County. At the time of those incidents, I was the interim tribal administrator, so I can sympathize with Nelson. And I was, handling a lot of responsibility when that emergency happened. And I reached for a binder in the executive office that said Tribal Emergency Operations Plan. And much to my dismay, when I opened it up, it was pretty much just empty with some tabs in there. So that was no use to me. And that really began kind of my work in the field of emergency management. Prior to that, and really kind of ever since then, or alongside my role, I've been a student. So I was a graduate student writing my dissertation when I agreed to help my tribal community as an administrator for a short period of time. And then I've just kind of done both. I finished my dissertation and I'm currently an assistant professor in the program in American Indian Studies at California State University, Long Beach, also known as Pavungna, which is an ancient village site of the Tongva people in Los Angeles County. So all of my work, again, has always had a tribal focus. With Intertribal Long-Term Recovery Foundation as a nonprofit, we kind of serve both government sectors as well as that community base. So we have a really unique role to play, and I'm hoping that I can share some of those insights with all of you. And I just want to extend my gratitude to Robert Holden for all his mentoring over these years, and also my thankfulness to Kelby Kennedy and her team at NCAI for inviting me to participate in this webinar.
Thank you for those kind words, Theresa. David Monroe.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Monroe with the Department of Homeland Security. I'd like to recognize the lands of the Piscataway tribe, where I'm calling from, and the Anacostan tribe, where the Department of Homeland Security's headquarters is located, just across from here in the Anacostia, or across the Anacostia River. One of the things that I want to do first is thank NCAI, Kelby and Robert, for inviting me, and it's great to see a lot of familiar names and work with this team in presenting this effort, by tribes, for tribes, if you will. So I'm kind of the odd duck out as the federal guy here, but I think I bring a couple of experiences that might be useful to our discussions, and I hope to bring those forward. And from 2006 to 2014, I had what I like to call one of the best jobs of my life, where I served the Morongo Nation and the Morongo people in Southern California as their emergency services director. And I like to share with federal government, with the people that I work with now, the ability that I had to walk down the hall and talk with the leader of a sovereign nation. And it was so impressed upon me that, every morning when I drive on the reservation, the tribe's, sign as you enter the reservation, Morongo, Band of Mission Indians, and at the bottom of the sign, it said a sovereign nation. And it reminded you of the importance of tribal sovereignty and tribal rights of self-determination that I think were emphasized last night in the president's executive order, emphasizing the importance to departments for our need to hold up that nation-to-nation relationship with Indian tribes and ensure that we have an engaged and meaningful tribal consultation effort, which has kind of in the matter of a week kind of turned around some priorities and efforts in our office at the Department of Homeland Security. There's a lot of things coming out of the White House right now, so we're really busy on catching up on those things. But the value of tribal leaders sharing what they want out of the Department of Homeland Security has been useful in preparing transition information and documents. So a little background of the department on why I'm here is we're the third largest federal executive agency. So the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Secret Service, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, U.S. Citizenship Immigration Service, the Transportation Security Agency, and the primary focus of your call, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, all fall under this, this for lack of a better way to explain it, this clearinghouse, this broader department. So I'll try and highlight some of the important connections that you can make and where the department can help not just navigate things that are or not ours, but the department's agencies and components and offices can provide support, but the whole of federal government, and the importance of meetings like these where you're sharing your lessons learned. So I have limited technical knowledge, and there's going to be a lot of times where I say, hey, look, that we have FEMA subject matter experts. I'm going to point you a lot to the regional tribal liaisons in FEMA and our regional tribal folks in our cybersecurity infrastructure security agency. But I really look forward to listening and learning along the way. But I always like to close my introductions with my cell phone and encourage anybody to give me a call, and I'll type it over here in the chat in a second, but 202-360-8998. Again, 202-360-8998. Robert, thank you so much again, and back to you, sir.
Thank you, David. And now Norma Reyes.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon, whichever you are at this point. My name is Norma Reyes. I am the former regional tribal liaison for FEMA Region 6. My career began with FEMA Region 6 in 2007 as a congressional affairs specialist, and then in 2011 I assumed the role of the regional tribal liaison. During that period, I worked with 68 federally recognized tribes, 4 in Louisiana, 23 in the state of New Mexico, 30 in the state of Oklahoma, and 3 in the state of Texas. Prior to working with FEMA, I also worked for the Department of Human Services. I served as a chief of staff for a state representative in the state of Texas. I served as a district director for a congressman, also from the state of Texas, and also worked for a county commissioner. I hope to, I retired on January the 1st. So my role here is primarily to share my experiences in terms of my knowledge and in terms of working with FEMA all those years. I look forward to speaking with you all and sharing information. Thank you.
And thank you, Norma, for that. And Kelby?
Thank you so much, Robert. Harito chumchukma so chipo yanish okfe hantalituk chatas yahuke chiminte yahuke. As I said earlier, my name is Kelby Kennedy. I am a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I was born and raised on my nation's reservation in southeastern Oklahoma. I am a policy counsel for the National Congress of American Indians, and 2 of my biggest focus areas within my work for the National Congress is tribal homeland security and emergency management work. Thank you so much again for taking a bit of time out of your day, hopefully both today and tomorrow and in March during this webinar series. I just want to extend my thanks not just to Robert, but to all of our presenters. I know that your knowledge and information that you will share with tribal leaders will be incredibly informative. Growing up on my nation's reservation, I can tell you firsthand, my nation was instrumental in not only protecting my own life, but the lives of my family members on our reservation. If you've ever been to Buffalo Valley, Oklahoma, I encourage you to go there, but I always joke that we have about 2,000 citizens and 1,800 of them are cattle of people in that town. So it's a very small town, and tribal nations really are often the first and only line of defense when a disaster strikes Indian country. And I was raised in that environment. And so I know firsthand from my own nation's experience that having an effective tribal emergency management program can mean the difference between life and death for many of your tribal citizens. And so my hope for this entire webinar series is that you're able to take some fantastic firsthand information from our speakers, take it home and help your people and prepare for anything that might be on the horizon. So thanks again for spending your time with us today. And with that being said, I'm going to turn over the floor to Theresa to start walking us through the first portion of our presentation today. Theresa?
Thank you so much, Kelby. Go ahead and advance the slide. So I'm going to be just providing a brief introduction and overview about the Stafford Act and how it influences and really is the governing authority to declare a presidential disaster. And then my colleagues and co-presenters are going to delve into more of the nuts and bolts of what's involved. So I'm sorry, my computer's sending me alerts if you heard that beep. So as I said, I've been the executive director, and now I simply call myself the executive board liaison for the Intertribal Long-Term Recovery Foundation. We formed officially as a nonprofit. I think we received our status in 2009, but we were operational since 2007 and 2008 as a recovery organization, helping San Diego County tribes access resources and information about how to rebuild after the Pumacha and the Witch Creek fires. So our mission overall is to help American Indian people and tribal nations affected by wildfires and other disasters recover and become resilient. And so currently our executive board of directors has 13 tribes across San Diego and Riverside County. And you could see their tribal flags here. So if any of our membership is on the call, I want to give a shout out to you and recognize your service for all of these years to continue to educate our communities and make sure that we're safer every single day. And so, Kelby, go ahead and advance the slide. Next slide, please. Well, while she's advancing the slide, oh, go
Theresa,
ahead.
I did advance the slide. It's currently showing.
Okay, I could see it. The Stafford Act. For some reason, it's not showing on my Zoom. Oh, there it goes. Okay, I just had a little delay. I'm sorry about that. So for those of you that are really new to emergency management and are just sort of getting your feet wet, it is overwhelming at first, and it is another federal program that we sort of have to learn the bureaucratic ins and outs of, but it is essential, I believe, to operating a healthy and successful and strong tribal government. It's my position and something that I've advocated for a long time now that, emergency management preparedness needs to become a daily part of tribal governance. We just simply can't rest anymore. And there are resources to get started that Nelson and Jeff, and I know Dave are gonna be sharing more about. So essentially here, the Stafford Act it's the William T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. It was passed in 1988, and it's the law that governs how the U.S. nation responds to emergency events in all forms. And as Dave was mentioning in his introduction, he's going to talk about how now FEMA and other agencies, right, are rolled into Department of Homeland Security. So I'm not going to go into that too much, but essentially this law dictates how the response and coordination for an emergency goes from local, regional, and state levels to federal response, and then sort of triggers all of the powers and resources that can be deployed to remedy it. So originally, it really was a federal to state process. And at that time, from 1988 till about 2000, tribes were considered part of local governments, right? But this was really disregarded tribal sovereignty. And so advocates for tribal communities, advocates like NCAI and other agencies nationally, regionally, always pushed back against that designation because we didn't want that state tribal relationship. We wanted the federal tribal relationship to protect and enact our sovereignty. And I just have this little chart here. I looked it up to give you some data. In 1988, there were only 16 presidential disasters declared across the country. I didn't have the time to go through and drill down and see how many of those were tribal, but I'm guessing there are very few. I think if there were, at that time period, most tribes, if they were involved at all in emergency management response, they had to roll it up through the state, or else they didn't get that relief money. In 2016, you can see this jump. There are 101 presidential disasters, and then I have the information for 2017 through 2019. And a lot of those disasters, the 59 that occurred in 17 and 18 and the 61 in 2019 occurred in California. I'm sure across the Midwest, we had those incredible tornadoes that struck in the Midwest. And then in 2020, we're up to 104 already. And of course, a lot of that's due to, again, pandemic, but the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the fires, the flash flooding, it's all, coming to a head. So the time is now to get ready and prepare yourself and your tribal community. Next slide. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that in the early iteration of the Stafford Act, tribes were kind of considered a part of local governments. And again, the legislation did privilege the states and other local jurisdictions and really didn't define tribes as being a part of that framework. And so that stayed in place until the Sandy Recovery and Improvement Act. which passed, and then that law, it amended the Stafford Act and changed the language from state and local governments to now include the language of Indian tribal government. So it sort of reframed FEMA's approach, and which is how we got this tribal pilot declaration guidance in the first place, and sort of more direct access for tribes to FEMA, and kind of revamping the way declarations can be processed and declared. Next slide. Okay, so here I have a quote from one of my former executive board members and co-founders of the ITL-TRF. Mr. Adam Geisler is a member of the La Jolla Band of Luiseño Indians, and he always says, you know, the further away you are from one disaster, the closer you are to the next. And he says that out of his own experience, his tribal experience as a tribal citizen, and then as a community advocate, because the La Jolla tribe has unfortunately endured many fires, floods, and other disasters, and has really been in the forefront in San Diego County of sort of leading the way in terms of working with federal, state, and other local agencies to become better prepared and to actually share their work with the rest of the community. So again, as I said, in 2007 is when my tribe experienced a series of catastrophic fires, but in 2003 and 2005 in San Diego County, we had major fires. And so since that time, I have just a list of here. Fires tend to be the biggest threat in terms of quick and massive damage to our communities. I'm going to knock on wood and say we haven't had the big earthquake yet, but I'm sure that would eclipse all of the fires. And as you can see, through every year leading up into 2020, California has experienced bigger and bigger and more devastating infernos. And so most of these fires occur in areas where there are lots of tribal lands and tribal nations. And so it's been, you know, kind of a cyclical pattern of learning where tribes sort of get the test first, right? We get tested by these incredible events. And then we're sort of always trying to backfill and backpedal to get what we need in place. And so again, my main message is to encourage everybody, if you don't have some of the plans in place that you need, to start today or tomorrow working towards that goal. Next slide. Okay. So the declaration process and some key steps that you need to take. Again, this is just an overview, and my co-presenters are going to go into it in more depth. But during and immediately after an incident, you'll know very quickly if your tribal resources are going to be overwhelmed in response to an emergency or disaster. And as soon as that happens, when you realize and you recognize this is beyond the scope of our control and beyond the scope of our resources, that's the time, if you have a tribal emergency operations plan in place, to activate it. If you have a tribal emergency operations center, activate your EOC. Start switching over your workers into response mode to protect and preserve as many lives and, you know, property as you can. And then during and immediately after the incident, you want to be consistently taking note of the damages, right? Conducting sort of window damage assessments if you can, right? You don't want to go in if it's unsafe, but you can tell right away. Your workers, your everyday people that are out and about on your lands are going to know when you're in trouble. But I just want to say it's really important that people start tracking that, tracking their time, tracking the damages, because you'll need all of that to calculate your potential losses, and then start to calculate the respective cost estimates needed for recovery. And all of that has to be put into a per capita basis for your needs. And this will sort of start to trigger the threshold for a FEMA declaration, whether it's a state of emergency or a major disaster declaration. And both of those declarations by the tribe have to be accompanied by resolution and signed obviously by your tribal leadership, or the people that have the authority to enact those declarations. And then above all, I'm going to just hammer this home, because this is something I've helped many tribal communities with in San Diego County and Riverside County, is to keep records and an accounting of all response activity, personnel, and materials that are put forth to address the immediate needs of the emergency situation. And this includes council members' times, volunteer time, any organizations that come in. do your best to set up some form of tracking and record keeping that could be utilized to show the dollars you spent, and potentially you can have those dollars reimbursed to you. Next slide. I think I'm handing it over at this point to Dave Monroe, who's going to go into more depth about his experience and the process. Dave?
Theresa, thank you very much. So I was asked to provide some notes on just 3 key items over the next couple of minutes. And then I'm going to pass it over to Nelson, and then we'll get to Q&A kind of for this section, kind of the stuff that we've addressed so far. But I'm going to highlight some background on the pilot guidance and the efforts that the Federal Emergency Management Agency took to develop that, and have some discussion on additional access and resources and how tribes can make sure that they keep in mind how they can get to those. I'll talk a little bit of the Stafford Act itself. I know Theresa introduced it, but from the department level and kind of how folks look at the development of the Stafford Act and where it came from and how it fits or doesn't fit Indian country, and then how the department and FEMA, this is really all of FEMA's, how FEMA uses those authorities that are provided to it by Congress, and how tribes have been working to make those fit better. And I'll give a little more history on some activities, and then I'll also hit these later in the day again. And then I want to really emphasize the importance of our subject matter experts in the field and the folks that that FEMA can mobilize relatively quickly to provide assistance. So first, as I shared in the opening, is Indian country has this knowledge. I mean, this isn't some big giant secret, of emergency management. And I think a good friend of a lot of people, by looking through this list, a good friend of a lot of people, Ken Tiller, shares a story of pueblos and how nations would prepare, in the past for the worst of disasters. And then, there's a million stories that tribal leaders can tell much better than I ever could repeat. But I think the importance is that the way the federal government is trying to approach our support Indian country isn't necessarily limited to just the authorities in the Stafford Act. So one of the things that Theresa said is keep track of everything that goes on. And people used to laugh at me because the first thing I would do is give them one of those 88-cent composition notebooks that I got at Pick and Save, like, here, write everything down in the world that you're doing and keep track of everything. And how that's important is there's not just disaster authorities within the Federal Emergency Management Agency. There are just under the Stafford Act, and then FEMA has some ways that they can help other agencies. But the USDA, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Interior, these have different authorities. Although the Department of Interior has never been funded for emergency management, they have utilized some of their discretionary funding for it. So that provides you some other avenues. But the importance of looking at the people in attendance today, and you read that, I mean, that's who's been through this and who works to provide us feedback. So we appreciate that. But the importance of knowing the tribal liaisons in the FEMA region that you're in and having a working relationship, whether it's it should be a staff to staff relationship, and then leadership to leadership, in parity with folks, at the right levels. But that's important because when you just share with those folks in the field, hey, here's our problem, here's what the tribe is facing, they can find avenues to potentially help assist, or they can tell you, hey, we don't have that authority, you need to work with Congress, we don't have that authority, you seek to get that authority, we're happy to do whatever we can, but here's our limits, because we work on laws and we work driven, based on what priorities are of in this instance, what priorities are of tribal leaders and what comes to us from tribal associations like the National Congress of American Indians, which led to the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, or support for that in 2012. Gosh, I forget the governor who introduced it, but it was in Sacramento at the National Congress of American Indians where there was a big push, and then I think that really provided a lot of support and got different agencies and support for that. So FEMA Tribal Affairs staff, and they're in their, not just general tribal liaisons, but in the response and recovery director. Most of you have met Jessica Speck, who was a big part of the consultation and development of the pilot guidance. So Robert showed a picture of the 2017 cover of the pilot declaration guidance. There's 3 phases in there that FEMA identifies. The first is work with tribes to develop guidance within the authorities that were provided that help us determine what a disaster is. Now, sometimes it seems kind of obvious. We all know what a disaster is, but with federal taxpayer resources, we need to make sure that we're following something that's not subjective. So we tried to create it as, or FEMA tried to create it as objectively as possible with significant feedback from tribes. Over, if you just count numbers, over 3,000 total comments on, on what FEMA's crafted for that. So the DHS authorities, or the Stafford Act, is kind of the authority that was changed to provide for assistance to tribes. In 1988, when it was created, and then a decade later when there were some significant modifications, most of those the bill drafting was crafted by the National Governors Association. So it was state centric. It was written for states, with input by states. And so I understand tribes struggle with that. FEMA staff understands tribes struggle with that. And so we're trying to find avenues and options of how you can address or help us address where there's shortfalls. So keep in the back of your mind, is there or does Stafford Act work in Indian country? And if it doesn't, how can you continue to work with us so we can work with the other branches of government to make sure that we're sharing what you're providing for us. So Congress provides those authorities, the executive branch, we carry those out, and FEMA staff are pretty creative in things that they can do within those authorities. So then that's why working with those regional staff who can provide insights, and they know things that are happening at your tribe and on your lands, they can help with those. And that's really make sure that you're messaging to us what your needs are. And then I just want to highlight kind of the third thing I was supposed to emphasize is the development of the pilot guidance, and FEMA still is focused on robust engagement to inform our initial drafting of anything. And although we couldn't really support this effort directly, we'll look forward to supporting future efforts and efforts of NCAI, so you can share and message things with you. But the rulemaking process that NCAI has asked for us to go into, that was that third step in that guide. So there's 3 steps. One was the development. Second was the pilot guidance, implementation, and the rollout. So that's where we're at now, and we're utilizing that guidance. And as Robert said, it's not law. It's the interim piece to get to the rulemaking process. And the third piece is that rulemaking. That we hope this information. I'm here to take a lot of notes. Will inform and our work with tribes. So hopefully I highlighted those 3 things for you. If you've got any questions, save them for right after Nelson Andrews Jr. So Nelson, over to you, sir.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Monroe. Appreciate all that information you shared. A lot of good topics and information provided by you and Theresa as well. So basically, in my portion of this segment here, I'm just going to give a little bit of background of what we are dealing with and experiencing for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe during the current national emergency declaration that we are under for the COVID-19 pandemic. One thing I wanted to mention that I didn't explain during my introduction earlier is I'm also the co-chairman for the United South and Eastern Tribes USET's Homeland Security Emergency Services Committee. So through that organization, we have had many collaboration efforts with NCAI, and a lot of those were toward amendments and revisions potentially toward the Stafford Act, because as David had mentioned, the Stafford Act is extremely state-centric. We can get into that a little bit more within the coming days, but one of the ultimate goals would be to have our own act in place for tribes. The Stafford Act was not really designed, for tribes, and basically they tried to fit a round hole peg into a square hole. So back to what we're experiencing now. So our tribe, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, we were the first tribe in our region, in FEMA's Region 1 here, and the second in the country to become direct recipients under this, the Presidential National Emergency Declaration for COVID-19. But long before the, well, I would say not long before, but at least a month before the president even declared the pandemic a national emergency, I had approached our tribal council, and as Theresa had explained in the process, is you have to get approval, from your tribal council through a resolution to go ahead and declare a state of emergency. And part of that is activating, as she had mentioned, your emergency operations plan and your emergency operations center. So I approached our tribal council to declare a state of emergency. The pandemic was just picking up in our region, in our county, in our area, and we had started getting cases within our tribal community as well. But at that point, it was may recall there weren't many resources available at that time. We had, I think, 2 boxes of N95s in our stockpile, and the national stockpile was depleting as well. So I knew we had to take action. We had to go and turn to the feds to get some assistance, basically in an effort to protect our tribal community. So basically, we went forward and requested a state of emergency to our tribal council. After that was done, we closed down our government center to all non-essential employees, and immediately made a request to FEMA for direct federal assistance. Shortly after I made that request, it was done through a letter. I had to write a letter to the FEMA regional administrator. And after that was initiated, I got a phone call directly from the region. And I used to work in the region, so that we have that ongoing relationship. And they had asked, they said, "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Because it's going to be a cumbersome, a burdensome process. There's a lot of paperwork. It'll be easier to go into the state." And I explained that I do understand that. I know it's going to be a lot more, and a lot more than I had expected. But we said, hey, we want to become direct recipients, because this is more than the amount of paperwork and sleepless nights and long days. This is about our sovereignty, which ties into our mission statement as well. Our mission statement is to support our tribal citizens, to ensure that as a sovereign nation, we work together to make all reasonable efforts to prevent and mitigate against all hazards, prepare for and respond to emergencies, and initiate recovery activities on our own whenever possible. So for us becoming direct recipients under this national emergency declaration, it was more about our sovereignty. But what I didn't really expect was the additional red tape, since this was the first time our tribe was going as a direct recipient. But we'll get into that a little bit more. Next slide, please, Kelby. So one of the first requirements we had to do, we had to establish our PA administrative plan. One thing we had not worked on previously was this admin plan. We had all of our other plans in place. One of the most significant and important plans that a tribe can have is your hazard mitigation plan, and one of the most common plans is your emergency operations plan. A public assistance administrative plan is something that a lot of tribes might not have experience with or even be familiar with. States, on the other hand, they will have these plans, all their plans pretty much reviewed and worked on throughout the year with FEMA. So I think a lot of the reasoning behind the FEMA region calling me and asking me, if I wanted to go into the state, it was an easier process, not just for us, but it would have been an easier process for them as well. And one of the reasons was this plan, and also the FEMA tribe agreement. So we started off kind of winging it with this plan. We found the state PA admin plan on the FEMA website, and we started tweaking it. And in turn, we started working with headquarters, Jessica Speck, that David had mentioned. She reached out to me as well, and we created the tribal admin plan for our region, the tribal PA admin plan. So this plan was, was not created. We established it, and then we were able to share this with all of the other direct recipient tribes within the region. So it was a burdensome process, and what I attribute this to is red tape. There was, this slowed up the process, right? So now think about it, where we're at the point of the pandemic, where, we're just trying to get resources to support our tribal community. We're trying to get testing set up at our Indian Health Service clinic, and we're trying to provide testing, resources, PPE, in addition to all the testing kits over to our our tribal health clinic. Everything that was needed in the beginning of this type of pandemic, we were in the process of doing, literally, with a 2-person emergency management department, let alone working each night trying to get all of these deliverables completed as well. So finally we got the PA plan completed. It was in draft form, and it went back and forth for at least a month with the region. And then at the same time, we were getting our FEMA tribe agreement in place. So the FEMA tribe agreement is an important agreement. It's not as cumbersome as the PA admin plan, but if you're looking to become a direct recipient tribe, these are the critical pieces that you want to have in place, especially if it's a public assistance disaster. Most tribes will have a lawyer on staff, so your attorney can help with these types of documents. But one thing we definitely learned, a big lesson learned, was to have these things, these 2 pieces here, ready to go before an incident occurs. And it will be helpful if each tribe coordinates beforehand with your FEMA tribal liaisons and your tribal council and your tribal attorneys, to make sure that everything is in place, so you don't get caught up with some of the red tape that that we had experienced. I'll just close with saying the major differences for the tribes, like I had mentioned earlier, is there are not many reviews typically for your plans and agreements with FEMA. It seems that there's that direct relationship, with the state's emergency management agencies and governors, more so than with tribes. We're always on the short end of it, and more of an afterthought when it comes to being ready. But hopefully, from the experiences that we are going through and what we've already went through here during our webinars, you all will be able to take from that and be more prepared to assist your tribal communities for anything that may come. So that's pretty much it on this segment, Kelby. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nelson, David, and Theresa. As we said, we've got we'll take a pause for short Q&A, but no one has entered the chat room, but for this section, but certainly we'll follow up and we'll do a longer Q&A session at the end, as we said. Going once, twice. Okay.
Robert, there
Yes.
is a question there that is it possible to get copies of the PA plan and tribal agreements out to tribes so they can develop those early?
Good. All right. Anyone jump in, please?
Yeah, I can add to that. I mean, we have our PA admin plan. I can send out, I guess, the draft version that where we started off with, so it takes out all of our personal information, and the same with the FEMA tribe agreement. I believe I already have those set up, and I might have sent them to Kelby previously, but I'll look into that and get them over to Kelby for ours.
Robert, this is Norma. So also you can reach out to your regional tribal liaisons, and they may also have copies of the plans they can share as well. They've gotten permission from various tribal partners to do that. So you may want to reach out to your regional tribal liaisons as well.
Okay. Kelby, I've got this little tech problem here. Is there another question that came in?
Sure. Just two other questions, Robert. Really quickly to answer the first question, though, if any of our speakers, I know a couple of you have been kind enough to share your PA plan and tribal agreements with us. What I can do is follow up an email with the folks who registered for this webinar and send you the documents that our panelists are comfortable sharing with folks for your tribal nation to utilize. So just keep an eye out for a follow-up email. This webinar is also being recorded, and we're going to place it on NCAI's YouTube and the NCAI Emergency Management webinar or Emergency Management webpage. So we're also going to put important documents on that webpage as well that our speakers allow us to have on there, as well as the PowerPoints. In terms of other questions, another question that we got was, does the $1 million threshold include losses from casino operations? And I think that's probably directed to Theresa, as well as a couple other folks who spoke about the threshold in order to overcome.
So I wasn't sure if Norma wanted to jump in with her experiences there, but I saw Grat and Recheria, and I just wonder if that's Tim Campbell. So I'm going out on the edge to see if Tim is still there. And Tim, if that's you, great question. So there's you're correct as far as the best I can explain it. Of course, your folks out there in FEMA Region 9 are going to know this better, but there's a $250K minimum damage amount, which is different than a threshold. So prior to the tribal declaration pilot guidance, so prior to that effort that I talked about, there was $1 million, and then it's $250,000 now. But that process that Theresa mentioned of how to do that preliminary damage estimate and assessment and those processes, that's where you really need to engage the FEMA folks, the pros from Dover, if you will, to help through that process. Not sure if that helped or if Norma has anything else to add.
That is correct, Dave. David, also the casino operations, that would be best to discuss with your region in terms of that. It depends. There are certain things they look at for that. So sometimes it may be and sometimes it maybe not. It depends on the different nuances. So I cannot give a definite answer on that. It's best to get that from your region in terms of how after they review your damages and your paperwork and whatever information they need to confirm that, they will let you know. But there are instances where it is included in the amount of damage.
I would just add to what Norma was saying about the nuances and differences with your enterprise operations. Like you might have a gas station, a mini mart, other commercial properties that you operate that are tribally owned and run. And typically those are going to have some level of business liability insurance. And that's what FEMA is going to look for first in terms of recovery and assistance. And then beyond that, I think exactly what Norma said, you're going to need to consult with your regional liaisons, probably with your legal counsel, as well as whoever your insurance carriers are to determine gaps. And then those specifics can be worked out as the declaration moves forward and as you start to develop plans for recovery and assistance. And I apologize, the 1 million, it's been in there for a while on my slides, so thank you for updating it.
Can I ask a question?
I'm sorry.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah, my name's Housekeeping, and I'm from the Navajo Nation. I'm employed with the Native American Disability Law Center in Farmington, New Mexico. I'm also the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities president. I was wondering if there's any kind of guidance document to ensure that disaster plans include people with disabilities when a disaster happens. Is there any kind of guidelines that I could look at to include into a disaster plan for the Navajo Nation?
I would say yes, sir, you can. You would have an appendix in your tribal emergency operation plan for individuals that have access or functional needs. That's, I believe, the current terminology for people who have differential needs than everybody else. And so you could have a separate procedure, but then there are additional resources. And I'll pause because I heard another colleague wanting to jump in on the answer.
Okay, and I was wondering if I could be referred somewhere where I could look at what is needed to include people with disabilities in the disaster plan.
Thank you for the question, sir.
FEMA has worked on some appendix and guidance documents that are out there. I'm at a loss to the name of them for access and functional needs specific issues. I will try to find that and send that to Kelby so she could push that out to you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Dave, did you have something you want to add real quickly?
No, we're good. We're good. I was just gonna, I'll help Jeff. And Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 101 addresses kind of the requirements that FEMA looks for in their emergency plans. And then there's the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA Standard 1600. And then, oddly enough, to mention to this group, the International City County Managers Association has a real great handbook, which is, I mean, it has the tools that you need that are really valuable. So we'll definitely put those together for Kelby. So sorry if I stepped on anybody.
No, you're good. Thanks. Okay, with that, we'll move on to the next session. Who and what is eligible for disaster for assistance tribal declaration? Theresa, please.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so this is my final contribution other than Q&A for the presentation. So the bottom line, I think, with disaster declarations, because of the amendment to the Stafford Act and the change in language so that tribes could go direct to the federal government, you have a choice in how you declare. So you could become a tribal direct recipient in much the way that Nelson explained with his tribe declaring and the process that he was outlining. And so you would make a direct declaration to the president through your regional FEMA office. The states and local agencies kind of encourage you, just in terms of local relationships, to copy maybe your state Office of Emergency Service liaison or officer, to let them know if this is a bigger event, but that you're deciding to go direct. They just want to keep track of that information. And with that direct declaration, you'll be able to manage, you'll have the choice to manage your public assistance, which is the direct damage from the incident and any infrastructure mitigation following up from that incident. And you can also you have the option to go with the state to administer your individual assistance, which is going to be covered by Jeff and Norma further down the line in the presentation. So they'll explain some of the details in that. So the federal eligibility for this type of declaration, we've kind of already talked about this, is that, the key document that you really need in place to get started with your emergency management program is to have an approved FEMA pre-disaster hazardous mitigation plan that's current, that's updated, that again is approved. This isn't it's not a slight against you if you don't have that plan approved. Maybe it's in draft form, maybe it's gone through a series of drafts and you still haven't had it authorized by your tribe and sent off to FEMA. You have the option to complete the PDM within a 30-day window after the declaration is approved. So, and then there's also some leeway in that. So if you're going back and forth with FEMA during this time period, I believe it's even up to like 90 days to get it approved once the disaster is declared. But my colleagues can correct me if that timeline is off. Your second option is to declare as part of the state. Again, if this is a bigger incident that's impacting other counties, other jurisdictions, the state is going to want to put in that declaration themselves. And so you would be designated as a subrecipient of the state. You'll still need to follow the same protocol in terms of like declaring that your resources are overwhelmed, what your damages are, what your needs are going to be, but you'll roll this up through the state. And they will ultimately include that with their needs and their damage assessments. As a state subrecipient, the tribal government can still be eligible to receive all categories of public assistance, as well as, and possibly without having a tribal mitigation plan approved through FEMA, because essentially the state's plan and your local county's plans need to be addressing as well tribal needs within those regions. They vary across Indian country, but hopefully, you know, in this day and age, we can be building bridges and not blowing them up. And I just encourage people to reach out and never kind of discard those relationships, because they can be incredibly important. And so finally, the only, you know, warning that I have is that you can't declare as both a tribal direct and a state subrecipient, because FEMA, as you know, we all know, a federal agency, they do not want to have any duplicative services. And that includes any services that go out to your community members for individual assistance and recovery. There's going to be a process called disaster case management that individual households will have to undergo. And that's, again, something that a tribe can manage directly, or you can hand it over to the state, and FEMA will still assist you in that process. So you're not only just dealing with state or local officials. I think I only had one slide, Kelby, right? I'm not sure if I had another. Oh, I have one more. Yes. Can you do the next slide? So these are the categories that are eligible for assistance. So with the declaration approval, you automatically are eligible for any emergency work directly related to the incident. And these are categories A and B, which means any debris removal, and then any emergency protection measures that you had to implement as a tribal government to safeguard your community and your homelands. And I'm gonna let my colleagues go into detail about that. And then the permanent work categories, the C through G, this really comes out and sort of after the incident, more once you move into recovery phase. And these are all programs that and categories that you would designate damages towards. And so with all of this work, you generally have to meet a 75% federal to 25% non-federal cost share match. And so for some tribes, this is incredibly difficult to come up with that those matching funds, which is why I was saying to track everything in the very beginning, as soon as you start to respond to an incident, because you can use some of that, whatever tribal resources and funds you put in, if you can't get reimbursed for them, they can become in-kind match to your cost share. You can also request a waiver, and I believe the maximum percentage to waive the federal cost share is a 90% federal cost share to a 10% non-federal cost share. But there may be exceptions. So I'll let other people's experiences, but I've seen an 85-15 pretty common in California. And I've also seen the 90-10, but you again submit a letter and ask for that waiver. And then Nelson explained very well the administrative plans that you need in place. Next slide. Work performed, materials and supplies. It's redundant, but as Dave said, get out your notebooks, get out your pen and paper, and just start the time people come on the clock, the time they go off the clock, you know, every kind of material that they use. It's not too big or too small, and then really start to come up with the system to put it in, so that when it comes time for the reimbursement and the identification of what you've outlaid in response to the incident, you can have an opportunity to recoup those costs, or if not, use them as in-kind costs for your cost share. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Hanson.
So thank you, Theresa, and I know she covered kind of the category areas. So I just wanted to give some examples of things that we have been able to be successful with during disasters. The Choctaw Nation, we have gone as a subrecipient to the state. We've gone as a direct recipient under a state declaration, and then we've also gone as a direct recipient under our own declaration. And so we've gotten a lot of experience in the various efforts and what it takes in those, but in each one of those disasters, there are some very common eligible things that we do. So sheltering is a big one for us. Our primary hazards here is ice storms, tornadoes, and floods. And with each of those, there's going to be a sheltering issue. So you can get sheltering as a whole is an eligible expense, and that can be either congregate or non-congregate sheltering. So one of our primary go-tos for sheltering is to pay for hotel nights for our citizens if they have to relocate due to a flood, or we've taken it beyond large disasters, even to a family home fire. We help them with that. Obviously, when you shelter folks, you have to feed them, so feeding cost is always an eligible expense. Any supplies that you purchase for the response generally is a Category B eligible expense if it is directly related to the response itself. Another measure that we've been able to deal with quite frequently is debris. We have written into our emergency operation plan that if we have a tribal citizen's home that has debris on the house, or it is inhibiting egress from the house, so if it's blocking their way out, or if it is blocking emergency vehicles from getting to them to provide aid, we do go in and clear that, and we've been successful in getting that those measures reimbursed as well. Obviously, if you have tribally owned property that is held by the tribe, that would be your infrastructure, and so if you have damages there, that also we've been relatively successful getting those projects written up. Ranches, I think a lot of tribes are big into the ranching industry. We are, and we've had major floods that have wiped out. At one year, we had 3 of our larger ranches that were completely underwater, and we were able to even look at fencing when we had to go back and replace the fence. Getting the debris out and fixing the fence, getting those things repaired. We're eligible as tribal infrastructure. So there's a lot of avenues that you can go with this. But again, like Theresa and so many others have already said, document from the minute you start till, even after you're done and you're just doing the paperwork, even track those hours, track the equipment that you're using, track the vehicles, track the man hours, because all of that stuff will ultimately go toward being able to really identify what your damages really are, and getting that damage assessment done before you go and ask for a disaster declaration from FEMA. And I believe now I'm going to turn it over to Nelson.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. I'm just going to kind of piggyback off of the eligibility requirements for disasters. My presentation is going to be based more around what we're dealing with as far as the public assistance disaster we're under for COVID-19. Similar to what Jeff was explaining about the sheltering portion, we have for the past 7 months, we've been providing non-congregate sheltering for our tribal community members. This is primarily based off the homeless population of our tribal community. The way this works is the tribal nation has to upfront the costs of the sheltering. So similar to how Jeff does that with his nation, we use hotels and motels as well. So we had to go ahead and get agreements in place with each motel that we were going to put our homeless tribal members in, but also agreements in place with the motels that folks were going to use for isolation and for quarantine. That part alone can be tricky, right? Because you have to get a motel to agree to allow folks who may have COVID to isolate in their property. So the agreements typically will look like the tribe paying for the cleaning after that 2 weeks stay is up. But when it comes to the non-congregate sheltering during COVID for homeless folks, this isn't like, after a flood or something like the things along the lines Jeff was explaining. these folks are in there for the long haul, a lot of times, right? So we've had, some of our tribal homeless population living in motels now, for several months. So what we're trying to do is, we're trying to work with our housing department to get them into, permanent housing, things like that. So after all these folks are sheltered and you're paying for their stay, you have to work on, well, we do from the emergency management department, we have to work on getting that money back. So as Theresa had mentioned about that 75% cost share, which is, now changing, hopefully, well, from the recent information I've heard, to the 100%. But what we've been doing this whole time is requesting reimbursement for 75% of the funding back. So we've had we've spent roughly about $500,000 just on motels. So that funding has to come from our tribal funding. And what we do is we submit for the remainder of that for the 75% reimbursement. But that entails getting set up in the FEMA grants portal. So after you all get you get set up with, you get your PA admin plan in place, you have your FEMA tribal agreement in place, everything's already set up. After you do your applicant's briefing, which I'll explain in the next segment I have, then you have to get this, it's called the FEMA grants portal. Once you get that set up, all of your reimbursement requests are going to go through this portal, and it'll be critical to have somebody on your staff trained with this. They're going to it's going to require specific items, such as, like, for in this example, for sheltering, all the invoices and receipts, proof of payment for for these stays. You also have to request through FEMA monthly reimbursement approval. So what that looked like for us was we had to write an emergency order every month and submit it to the FEMA region, which they actually just did away with last month. But every month we had to provide all the data: how many people are staying within the hotels, right? How many folks, how many families, the cost of each hotel, geospatial coordinates, everything, all the data. Every month we had to update it and send it to FEMA, and then you were hoping you were going to get approval. So basically, as long as this pandemic is still ongoing, then we will continue to get reimbursement and approval for that. I guess we'll have to think about what we're going to do down the road after this is said and done, because we have so many folks still utilizing these motels. So that's it for the sheltering piece of it. One of the other things that we've had to do also is submit for reimbursement requests for our emergency operations center costs, and these are also eligible public assistance emergency protective measures that all get submitted within the FEMA grants portal as well. Initially, when we declared a state of emergency, and got the FEMA tribe agreement in place, we started purchasing equipment to make our facility ready for in the next phase in the plans. One of the plans we didn't mention was, for us, we had to write a reentry plan, basically, of how it would look, right? So, not to get too far off track here, but for a lot of tribes, your community and government center is your hub, right? So for us, we have a tribal school under the same roof as our tribal government operations center. We're all where council has office space, right? We also we'll have a gymnasium. We have a workout center. So basically everything that a town would have, right? We all know, like, is tribal representatives. It's all under one roof. So for the planning aspects of that and moving forward with getting everything set up, it's you're trying to separate each section of a facility, which a town would basically have set up as separate facilities. That's how we're set up here for our tribe. So we basically had to get everything in place to make it ready to reopen, right? Thermal cameras. We had to get all of the staff set up to work remotely. All of these things are eligible for reimbursement. And then you have to submit everything again back into the FEMA grants portal for, to recoup some of your funds. Another thing is the overtime for the essential employees, and that's what we're working on now. All the overtime for folks who are doing things outside of their normal job duties, like delivering PPE supplies, to tribal members that are, at home or in hotels or wherever on the reservation or off reservation. Those types of things you can submit as an approved emergency protective measure as well. But there's obviously a lot more items that are approved as well. But this is just a couple excerpts from what we've been dealing with and working on for approval. I believe that's the only slide I have for this segment. So right now, I think we'll turn it back over to Kelby, or for questions and answers. How did you want to go about that?
Yeah, Robert, are you still perfect? Doing events live is always interesting in the age of COVID. So we're going to unmute Robert's line, and I think we're going to stop for a couple of questions that we got in the chat during this section. Robert?
There was a question that someone had asked regarding the FEMA and other FEMA officials to be involved in this session. And yes, it would be great, but I have to be honest with you. Not that I'm not ever honest with you. That's what it sounds like, right? At the outset, we had asked headquarters to give approval for some of the regional folks who had worked directly with tribes out in the various regions, as well as headquarters staff to become involved with this. But somehow there was a differences of opinion in regards to whom FEMA thought would be they had a different approved list as opposed to the folks we were interested in working with who had direct relationships with FEMA, and so nevertheless, in the interest of time and wanting to make sure that we were able to meet the deadlines for doing these webinars, we got some of the best folks we could find in Indian country. Believe me, they've got decades of experience, and I am so much appreciative for their volunteering to do this work for us. And so we've got the best of the best. So nevertheless, FEMA, you can have conversations with FEMA. You can, they will work with you, but nevertheless, we are where we are. Thank you. Anything else, Kelby?
Yeah, so a couple additional questions, and I would also want to add, we are always excited to work with our partners in Homeland Security and FEMA, and continue to welcome their input as we continue doing the series and other important webinars. But as Robert said, we did do initial outreach to our partners, and the timelines didn't match up. So it's not that we didn't want to have FEMA at the table here. It's just the priorities and the folks that were available were just not matching up with the timelines that we had, which is perfectly fine. But I think, David Monroe did a fantastic job about, the point of these webinars are webinars designed by tribal nations for tribal nations. And so, there's still going to be a lot of really great info out there. So excited to continue adding to the conversation. We have two additional questions for our panelists. So one question is regarding sheltering, especially non-congregant sheltering. The question is, are tiny homes eligible, and do they have to be vacated after the emergency is finished? So I'm going to direct that over to our panelist.
So I don't know the correct and legal answer to this, but I do know that there has been work in the housing sector following disasters. Texas has implemented some procedures for housing following disasters where they're literally building houses. And, I would think that tiny houses would probably fit the bill, but I think it would ultimately be up to the tribe to be able to explain their reasoning and back that up with documentation. I don't see why it couldn't be explored.
And I
along.
think that brings, oh,
Go ahead,
go
Kelby.
ahead.
Go ahead, Kelby.
You know, I think that brings up a really important comment, right? When you live in the middle of Buffalo Valley, Oklahoma, or you live in the middle of rural Alaska, or a really rural place where a lot of tribal nations are, there isn't a local hotel, right? Like there's no hotel in the middle of, Buffalo Valley, Oklahoma. So how in the world do you house tribal citizens in non-congruent sheltering when you don't actually have a hotel that you can book for people? And I'll turn it over to Theresa because I know that she has some great information to share as well.
I just had a comment kind of following up on Jeff's and yours as well. Like I think many tribal communities just if they have a hotel, it's linked to their enterprise, right? And so I think the key from what my experience has shown me is that if you have a sheltering plan in place in your EOP that designates a certain tribal location for sheltering, and then once that capacity is met or maybe doesn't meet the full needs, that you're going to allocate space at a hotel or in these tiny houses or mobile trailers or something that you have, it needs to be sort of stated ahead of time. I think that's the key, because if you're going to coordinate with maybe a trailer park or a little rental place near you, you want to establish those rates ahead of time. Or a range of the rates ahead of time. And you want to distinguish between short-term emergency housing and then long-term housing until recovery and rebuilding occurs, right? So all of that, I think, needs to kind of go into your EOP. And then it's easier then to point to FEMA and say, hey, we already have this planned out. And it could be, again, it's going to fit your community, the capacity that you have, and you shouldn't feel badly like, oh, we don't have a big gymnasium or we don't have a hotel. Go with where you're at, but try to really think through, how you can quantify it, because then that, I think, is the key to getting reimbursed later on.
So Theresa, I wanted to quickly follow up on that. And you make a great point about the tribal nation already having a hotel as part of the enterprise. We have another question about if the tribe has a hotel and uses it to actually do the sheltering, do they get reimbursed for those costs, or is it considered part of the in-kind contributions if you have a cost share that's leveled by the federal government? And I will quickly add to the cost share component that the Stafford Act allows for up to the 25% non-federal cost share, right? That's the highest amount that FEMA can require the cost share. FEMA and the president can, decide, right, that they're going to have no federal cost share. President Biden last week actually signed a waiver to have 100% federal cost share for the COVID-19 presidential disaster declaration. So just to put it in the context, it's not an automatic, hey, every single time this is a 25% cost share. The federal government decides what that cost share is. The statute says it can be no more than 25%. But I did want to mention that. I know we'll talk about cost shares and waivers a little bit more, but back to the portion, if you do house your tribal citizens at the tribal hotel, is that considered, do you get reimbursed for that expense, or is it your experience that is counted as part of the in-kind contributions for the non-federal cost share?
I've seen it go both ways, but I've seen it not necessarily like a intertribal support, where one tribe evacuated to another tribe's enterprise and they put them up for a certain amount of days for temporary shelter. And I think there was a little bit of negotiation with FEMA afterwards to reimburse that tribe for hosting the other tribe. And then they had to kind of incorporate an agreement going forward that if this was going to happen again, this would be the rate essentially that the hosting tribe is donating to, right, contributing to the recipient tribe. And it went into their in-kind cost share match. But I think for direct, again, if you have, because each enterprise is going to have its own emergency plan as well. And so I would just say that to have your enterprise side of the house talk to your government side of the house and really see where they can align those things and recoup the most costs, right? Because insurance doesn't cover everything. That's my experience. But again, it's going to go to a different level for response and recovery.
Any of our other panelists want to take a crack at that? And if not, I'm happy to move on to a couple of additional questions that we've gotten in the chat.
So Kelby, I was just going to say, so during COVID, we had that situation when I worked for FEMA, and part of it is reaching out to the region and discussing the non-congregate sheltering, you're going to have to request that formally. And at that point, they will let you know what you need to do to make it eligible. You can also, in terms of get reimbursement, if there's a shelter, what is a temporary sheltering program that's activated, then the tribal member would, if they're eligible for that program, then the tribe would get reimbursed under that program. So it just depends what is activated during a disaster. But you do have to have a permission or an agreement signed by FEMA and you have to present it to them and saying, this is what we're looking at for non-congregate sheltering, and it needs to be approved. And the discussion then occurs in terms of what do you have to do? What are the requirements and those type of things?
Kelby, I was just going to add that Norma's exactly right. So the letters, the reimbursement request letters that we had submitted in the orders we had to send in every month to FEMA, we could have used them for something similar. If it was depending on what type of facility we wanted to use, that's all going to be in the hands of the region to, I guess, approve.
So I'll move on, just in the interest of time. I know that we could, all of us on here could spend like the next 4 hours talking about like this one subject, but I know we need to move along to the next two subjects. And so I'll quickly pull two questions together, and then we'll move on to the next subject, and then we'll make sure to collect all the questions in the chat for the next round of Q&A. So keep doing your questions in the Q&A. We are collecting them. We will answer them. We just need to move along our conversation a little bit. So Nelson, the next two questions are actually geared toward you. So I'm going to combine two of the questions. So there's a question about, how big is your tribal nation's population? And then the second part to the question is, did the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe receive treasury funds as well? If so, how did your tribal nation use the funding in response to expenses with declaring, with utilizing funding for FEMA as well? So how do you, I know that there was the coronavirus relief funds, how does that interplay with funding that you actually received from FEMA? And then I guess this other individual would also like to know kind of what size your nation is as well.
Sure. Yeah. So the size of our tribe, we're relatively small. Right now we have 2,965 tribal members, so a little bit under 3,000 tribal members in our nation. A large majority of them live close to Cape Cod within our surrounding counties, but we do have some tribal members that are living off reservation and out of state as well. In regards to the second question, yes, just like pretty much every other tribe, well, a large majority of tribes, we received some CARES Act funding also. So the CARES Act funding, we utilized, well, our tribal council had come up with, different criteria basically to how to spend the money, how to spend the funding. So some of the funding was distributed to tribal members, basically as stipends, based off of their needs during the pandemic. Some of the funds also are used to buy resources and supplies for tribal community members as well, based off of their needs within the pandemic.
Well, thank you, Nelson. We do have some additional questions in the chat. I also point out that Linda Zambrano has also put up some really fantastic information in the chat as well that I would encourage people to look at. We're going to have the NCAI events team add the resources that we put at the front of today's panel in the chat soon, because I know that some people had to come in late and they didn't have a chance to pick up those resources. So we'll add those in the chat and then follow up with an email with additional resources. With that being said, Robert, if you're okay with it, I will move us along to our next section on requirements for disaster assistance. And it's the perfect time to have Nelson go over some additional components with us. So I'll turn it over to Nelson. Thanks so much, Nelson.
Sure. Thanks, Kelby. So we already, got into the initial parts of this based off of, my earlier comments and presentation. So some of the things I didn't really touch on. This is what FEMA will call a short list of requirements. Based off of a public assistance declaration. So our declaration that we're under, this emergency declaration, is category B. So these were some of the tasks that we had to complete initially. So some of them are really basic, right? A lot of most folks will already have, you know, your DUNS number in place, but this is just, it's basically the same requirements that you would have when you go ahead and you apply for a grant, a federal grant. You're going to need pretty much the same steps to be followed, you know, for getting reimbursement through FEMA as well. So your payment management system, we had our PMS already set up internally for our tribe, but what was different for us was, you know, it wasn't the same format that our finance department already had in place. So I had to go ahead and get the PMS set up for myself, and it was weird. Our finance department was not even able to set this up. So when it comes to getting all of the reimbursement requests, I'm fully responsible for it. You know, so I submit everything through the FEMA grant portal, and then I have to go through the payment management system. And I heard a lot of other tribes were dealing with issues with some in our region are still like now trying to get their PMS set up. So it's not as easy as a process, you know, for some tribes, and it seems like it's been an issue for a lot of tribes. We already talked on the, you know, the PA admin plan and the FEMA tribe agreement. So I mean, I don't really want to get into the weeds too much on those ones, since we already pretty much went over them. I have some notes here on my computer I'm looking at that we were dealing with during that time. So I'll just touch on them a little bit. I have recipients should renew their administrative plans for PA on an annual basis. For a new incident that occurs within the year, the recipient must also submit amendments to its administrative plan to address specifics on the new incident. So, which goes back to you know, making sure you're updating your plans on an annual basis. States have this opportunity, it seems, more so than tribes. And the same will go for your agreement. The section that says apply for I mean, my bullet point, this is apply for disaster funding. So basically that's tied into what is known as an SF 424. Anybody who submits federal grants, you know, what an SF 424 is. So these are the same steps that you have to take when you're going ahead and requesting reimbursement as well. That all this stuff gets uploaded into the FEMA grants portal. And then acquiring access to the FEMA grants portal is going to be one of the key steps. It took us, you know, I mean, we worked on it and tried to figure it out. It took us, you know, probably a little over almost a month to get everything dialed in with that. But some of our counterparts and our other neighboring tribes in the region, you know, months, probably took them several months to even get set up. And I believe we're right now we're one of two tribes in the region that have started receiving reimbursement funds. You know, through this process. Some tribes are still working on that. Out of the 4 direct recipient tribes, I think we were the first, and then one of the neighboring tribes had just recently, probably last month, started getting funding reimbursement. The applicant briefing, I kind of want to touch on that one a little bit. So the way that like typically an applicant briefing will work for, say, a state jurisdiction, is they'll have their town entities, like the municipalities, they will go ahead and, you know, they will be the applicants that they're going to be conducting the briefing to. So the state will be conducting this briefing to the towns. But for us, we had to, you know, we had to figure out how we were going to do that, right? We all are under the same DUNS number for our tribe. So how would we do that? So the way it was explained to us from our FEMA region was basically to look at our tribal departments as the applicant. So we had an applicant's briefing for all of the tribal departments, but the end result is our emergency management department are the ones that submit all of the requests for reimbursement. So if anybody if a department needed to get something reimbursed, then we would submit that for them. So some of the critical things that you may want to consider is such, you know, and it's been said many times here, is the documentation, right? Make sure that everyone knows, you know, within your tribal organization, you know, that, you know, everything they spend, you know, that's related to that disaster or incident, you know, that is documented, and you know, you have accountability with your receipts and invoices, et cetera, and everything's noted. So, these are the types of things that are going to get, submitted for reimbursement. And after you do your applicant briefing, then you can start submitting your requests for the public assistance. And that's basically the meat and potatoes of it. You're gonna start submitting everything into the grants portals for reimbursement. And it's not as easy as everyone may think. Well, you may not think it's easy, but it's pretty it's pretty cumbersome in many ways. You're going to have to make sure that all the documents, everything is in line, because as soon as you submit it, it's not the end of the process. We're going back and forth weekly, sometimes daily, several times with the public assistance grant officer, basically asking for new items. And it's little, it could be something minor or something major, like GPS coordinates, or how many people actually worked for overtime and things like that. So yeah, it's an ongoing process. We're still doing it daily, and it ties into it's pretty much what I do every night. It's working on that portion of it in addition to everything else. So yeah, that's just basically an update of those shortlist requirements And that picture there was that was an example of TMAC. States have EMAC. We have through USET, we have the Tribal Emergency Mutual Aid Compact. We were delivering resources, food boxes to our sister tribe, the Aquina tribe on Martha's Vineyard. We used our emergency response boat, and the people you see in that picture, it's our FEMA tribal liaison and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention public health advisor, and representative from the Aquina tribe. Yeah, so that was just part of this incident we're currently under. An example of TMAC. So that's all pretty much. Thanks, Kelby.
Thanks so much, Nelson. We'll turn it over to Norma.
So Nelson went over a very, very good list in terms of what's required in terms of any declaration. If you came in as an emergency declaration, this is what COVID was. Majority of you came in as emergency declaration. So there's also a major disaster declaration, which is similar in the sense, however, it's a larger, more categories of assistance that's available, and that, of course, and again, it has to do it's in relation to fire, flood, or explosions in any part of the United States, and it's beyond the capability of the tribal nation to manage. So at that point, you request assistance from FEMA. For the major disaster declaration, you'll get you can be eligible for IA, individual assistance, public assistance, and hazard mitigation grant program. The difference is for an emergency declaration and a major declaration is primarily the IA and PA program. For emergency under the PA program, you're eligible for a category. Okay, remind me on that one. Category B for I think it's category B. How quickly we forget as I left FEMA, but anyway. So, however, for a major declaration, it expands to these other categories, which is repair of roads and bridges, repair of water control facilities, buildings, equipment, and utilities, parks, recreational facilities, and other items. So definitely, it's going to be a larger in terms of project worksheets that you're going to acquire. So it's very important that, again, documentation is so important, as everybody has mentioned before. You still will have to do the same things that Nelson explained in terms of the DUNS number, the portals, and those type of things. But once you've already created that, it'll be easier should you go for a major disaster declaration. Next slide. So, like it's been mentioned throughout the whole presentation, the travel mitigation plan is primarily, which is a hazard mitigation plan, is the primary thing that we look for, FEMA looks for when we're going to go direct. And what it is, you've got they say it's a requirement that you have it in place, approve hazard mitigation plan in place in order to apply for funds, but you don't. You can be in the process of completing it as long as you complete it within 30 days. And if you don't do it, you don't get it approved within 30 days, and you have you can then ask for an additional extension up to 90 days. However, if you will not receive any of the permanent work, which is the C through G reimbursements, until that plan is approved. It's approved. So really you have 120 days from the time that you get a disaster declaration. However, during that time frame, you will not get any type of reimbursements until that is done. Next page. Next slide. So the next slide.
I think we're having a little bit of
Okay.
issues with Kelby's computer, yeah. Hey, everybody. We're having a little bit of computer issues while Kelby rejoins. If you want to keep talking on this subject without the slide, if that's possible.
Okay, I'll try to remember. So I think throughout this whole discussion, I think there was, I'm going to touch a base on terms of the role of the tribal liaison, regional tribal liaison. That is so important. I think Dave mentioned at the beginning, David Monroe mentioned about it. It is so important that you develop that relationship with the regional tribal liaison or the tribal liaisons within your region. They're there to assist you with any questions, any issues. They'll get you the contacts that you need. They're there to provide you any type of technical assistance, answer your questions, to go ahead and forward any concerns that you might have to leadership. So again, that relationship is so important. Do not utilize them. Believe me, utilize them. They're all ready to assist. You know, they're eager to assist. They don't know what you need unless you reach out to them. So please take advantage of the tribal liaisons. That's what they're there for. Early on, Theresa mentioned in terms of if you're looking at going direct, if it's an event occurs and you sustain damage, quickly call your regional tribal liaison and start discussing what you're looking at. What were the damages that incur? How much are we talking about so far when you do your preliminary damage assessments internally, so that you can start those discussions. And also, I always used to recommend reach out to your state counterparts as well. The state counterparts, if you have a good relationship with them. That is up to you to do that. I mean, if you want or not. However, it's always good until you make that decision. If you're going to go direct, you're going to go as a subrecipient, it's good to be talking to both entities at the same time. So that at some point, they're aware of what's going on, FEMA's aware, and at some point you make that decision, and then you either break away or you decide subrecipient, then you go under the state. So again, your tribal liaison plays a big role in that as well. In terms of those communications. So.
Okay, with that, Dave, would you like to proceed?
Sure, thank you, sir. And Norma, great connection to just a couple points that I want to make. I know we probably need to do some adjusting of agenda, so I've tried to do some background messaging to pause. But you know, Norma, I think your point of the importance of the subject matter experts in the regions, and one of the opportunities that I ran into early in my career, both at a city and then with a tribe, is technical assistance with FEMA regions, and I always made it a plan to always have an ask in front of everybody. So I always had an unmet budget need in front of states, local, anybody that I could get an ask in front of, because sometimes things just happen to fall out. So one time I had an ask for a mobile command post. It was like $75,000 or something like that. And because there was a funding entity that could pass that money through, we were able to purchase that because they needed to spend the money and something that fit within the box. So it worked perfect by us having that relationship and that ask. So the importance in this is the difference in statutory authorities that FEMA's provided, and then kind of the regulations. So as I saw a question in the chat box about, why not just waive the match for everything? Well, as federal employees, I'm sure we'd all be happy to do that for but we have your requirements and standards, and so if we're not given that statutory authority to waive everything, and that's someone else's decision, all we can do is make the recommendation. So what we don't want to do, I think somebody said earlier, is get out in front of tribes. It's not for the federal government to decide what's best for you. Tribal leaders have made it very clear that hasn't necessarily worked for them in the past, and they don't want us making decisions for them. So in the regulatory processes where we can change or fix or provide waivers for things, I'm always happy to look at those. The next, and I think one of the most important things in my mind to leave with this is, and this is directly related to what Norma was saying in those relationships, is FEMA offers training. Not just their tribal curriculum, and the manager of the tribal curriculum, Katie Hurt, she's on here and she's great to work with and easy to get in touch with. But we also have the Center for Domestic Preparedness down in Anniston, Alabama, and both of those provide training, at reimbursable, expenses. Obviously it doesn't cover labor or things like that, but it usually buys you a plane ticket, gets you a place to stay for the week or two of training or whatever. And you're not just limited to taking tribal training. There's several courses that are just focused on some of the discussion items here, public assistance. So the assistance for those facilities that are owned by the tribal government. So if you need any assistance, those regional tribal affairs folks, they're your key to that. And then the same with our cybersecurity, infrastructure security agency folks. They can help get you to the right avenues for training and development. And then in exercising, part of your emergency operations plan, we talked about this earlier, a lot of these discussions, and Kelby said we could talk about this for the next 4 hours. We could talk about this for the next 4 weeks, I think. But tabletop exercises and actually walking through each of these scenarios. If the county public health officer wants to close something down, what impact does that have, or does it have any impact on a tribal enterprise? Those are great things to walk through, and it's probably a bad time to talk about these in the middle of your response to COVID-19 and trying to take care of your people. But when time or when we get back to normalcy, keep in the back of your mind that FEMA's looking and willing and ready to help. And and another lesson that I learned is we had an ask for FEMA technical assistance to do pandemic. Think of the time right now. This was back in 2007, pandemic flu training. We brought in all kinds of folks from Southern California to do these tabletop exercise, fully functional exercise, all in pandemic flu. And California had Newcastle, and there was a chicken and equine encephalitis. There were a lot of things going on in the public health world back then. But because we had the ask in front of FEMA, and FEMA saw that as a need that they wanted to address, we basically got those resources. So make sure you have those asks in front of us. Your ask from tribal leaders, I always recommend, just like what we do as federal agencies, the top of our letters say, dear tribal leader. Well, send that stuff straight to the cabinet secretary or the FEMA administrator or the people in senior leadership. So the political appointees for the administration, they know what those asks are, but also work with the career staff. So we know what things that we can help, move and help, tell the political staff how they're accomplishing their mission, what's allowable and how we can help tribes get to where they want to get to, in light of the president's memo from yesterday of strengthening that nation to nation relationship. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to any questions that still might be in the chat, or any for from the audience for the good of the group. And hearing none, I think I'm going to look to turn it back to Robert or Kelby or any other NCAI staff to point us in the next direction, or just pass it over to Jeff Hanson and Nelson Andrews Jr. for our next section, whichever route we want to take.
Thank you, Dave. This is Robert. I just want to let everyone know that before we go into the last section on process to request major disaster declarations, that we're going to extend this first day to at least 15 more minutes for Q&A, but we'll proceed as we are, as long as, you know, and we have access to our presenters as long as they're able to stay. So we'll continue in that direction. So with that, Jeff and Nelson.
Well, thank you, Robert. So this next section, we're going to really just kind of talk about what's the process, what does it look like to request a major declaration. So you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So the first thing that happens, so the disaster event occurs, and the first thing that you as a tribe will need to do is activate your emergency plan. Whether you decide to go and look for reimbursement for FEMA, whether you decide to do it on your own, you know, priority one is taking care of your people, and that's why we're here. So activate that emergency plan. The thing that I would like to stress the most, I think, about this is, and it's been said a few times, some of these plans, get them developed ahead of time. Work through the development, build the relationships with the right stakeholders, within your tribe. You've got several departments that will have assets that you may not think of that you can bring to the response. So getting to know those people and getting those items built into the plan, and then practice that plan. Practice it as much as you need to, and if you find something that isn't quite working out, make the change, practice it again. But getting that plan developed ahead of time is going to be a really, really critical part of preparing your nation to respond to the hazards. So again, going back, so you have a disaster that occurs. So the first step would be activating that plan, and doing what needs to be done to address the problem. But as we've said before, document everything. If it is a truck driving from point A to point B, document that truck, how many miles is on it, what size truck it is, who was driving it. All of that information can go toward that next step, which is defining what your initial damage assessment is. That's getting an idea of how severe this is. Can we handle it as a tribe with our resources? Do we need to bring in mutual aid resources from other jurisdictions? Are there tribes nearby that may have some resources that you can call on? I know for us, the Chickasaw Nation is right next to us, and they've got a lot of resources that we have relied on numerous times, especially for debris causing events. They've got guys that go out and take care of elders' homes in the yards. They take care of cemeteries. So we call those guys, and they come out and they cut trees for us. It's building those partnerships and bringing in those resources. So getting to that initial damage assessment, you're really just trying to determine where we are, what's been damaged, how big is this event really going to be. If you get to a point where you think, okay, this is beyond our capability, the amount of damage is going to be substantial, you can request a joint preliminary damage assessment with FEMA. Now, under the tribal guidance, it does say $250,000 before they will mobilize to come out and do a joint PDA. But you can start having those conversations well before you've identified all of that. So the minute it happens, I know Norma, and I think it was Josh that made the comment earlier. Norma was the tribal liaison for us, and she will be greatly missed. But if she knew an event occurred, she was on the phone calling me, that day, seeing if we needed something. So build those relationships, get that line of communication open very early. On a joint damage assessment, basically that is the opportunity to really go out, take a look at the damage, specify what type of damage assessment you're going to do. Is it going to be for public assistance? So is that going to be, are we looking at tribally owned properties, tribally owned roads, tribally owned infrastructure, or is it going to be an individual assistance damage assessment where we need to go out and look at tribal homes, or it could be both. I mean, depending on the nature of the event. So make sure and let them know. It has to be requested formally in writing. Make sure and let them know what type of damage assessment is going to happen, and get that process started. Once you're done, you've identified your damages. Obviously, the response is still ongoing at this point. Your chief executive, whether that's the chief, the governor, whatever the case may be for your tribe, can submit a request to the president through the regional administrator. What that looks like, and in the pilot guidance, it spells out pretty clear what all needs to be in there. I've listed some things here, but really I think the important piece to the request itself is tell the story. Tell what's going on. How has it impacted the tribe? It's your opportunity to really give the president a picture of what's happening at your nation, and that helps in the decision process. But you have to, define what type of assistance you're requesting. You have to define where that assistance will be used. That's always kind of a sticky point for FEMA sometimes when it comes to nations, is if they're going to be providing assistance, is it being implemented within the jurisdiction of the tribe? But don't hold anything back on that request. Let them know everything that's going on, and I think that is an area that sometimes we might not tell our story well enough, and I think that if we can tell that story better, you're more likely to have a positive decision on the declaration. You'll submit that to FEMA. FEMA will then take a look at all the information. They will make a determination on and provide a recommendation to the tribe, they will make a recommendation for the tribe to the president based on the information that you've given. And then if you get the declaration, FEMA will then go and notify the state. If the state gets a declaration, they will notify you. It's just make sure everybody's on the same page. But ultimately, going back to the whole point of this is just get those plans developed, talk often with the stakeholders, talk often with FEMA, build those relationships, and this process will be very, very much smoother if you do. One of the things that we've gone through this process, there are templates, and FEMA can share information, and they can help build these requests. When I did the last declaration request, I looked at a previous request that somebody else had gotten just to kind of get a structure. So there's lots of opportunities out there and areas where you can begin from, and you don't have to start from scratch. So,
Jeff, this is Norma. Can I add also that when you're developing the plan, also, FEMA can provide technical assistance. I mean, not the plan, your submission, that you can get technical assistance if you've never done it before. They can kind of guide you in terms of what should you be highlighting, and because it all comes down to you telling your story, like Jeff said. How did it impact your tribe? Everything, whatever it is that you, as you sit and you look at the damage, you identify what was impacted, anything that was impacted, you expand on that. Also, when you're doing the initial damage assessment, insurance coverage is also going to be part of that whole thing. Remember, FEMA will not reimburse what insurance is going to cover, so that you need to have that information ready as well, because FEMA is going to ask for insurance policies and and those type of things. So, and Jeff, you can probably discuss that a little further because you've been through it, but insurance coverage is also very important during this process.
Yeah, absolutely. And to also touch on the technical assistance, like Norma said, that has been vital for us. We've utilized technical assistance on every disaster we've had. So definitely reach out and ask for that. As far as insurance goes, Norma is correct. They are going to require any kind of insurance documents that they can get their hands on. As an example, we had a major flood that flooded about 70,000 square feet of a hospital, and largest disaster we've ever had. And we ended up not getting a project worksheet written for that because of insurance covered part of the rebuild. But even the insurance adjuster's paperwork plays a factor into how FEMA will address reimbursements. In that instance, we did not get reimbursed because the adjuster did not do some silly formal paperwork that FEMA wanted. It is what it is. We tried to fight through it, but insurance does play a very, very big part across the board, and how that is documented for FEMA.
And again, I'm going to plug again for the tribal liaisons. When we talk about, requesting all these preliminary damage assessments, discussions for TA, you need that, and all, it all goes through your tribal liaison. So that's why it's so important that you develop that relationship. And I'm going to keep kind of harping on that because that is so important. That's whenever a tribe needed anything, they would call me. Or I would call them asking, hey, what do you need? But again, that relationship is so important.
And Norma, yeah, I'll echo your words and Jeff's words. Our relationship with our liaisons here in the region are very good and very fluid. If it wasn't for for our current tribal liaison, Ms. Regina Morado, I believe she's on the call now, we would be missing out on a lot of resources and guidance. But I just wanted to kind of touch back on a couple of things that Jeff had pointed out too regarding your emergency plan and the pre-planning. For us, for our tribe, how that all happened and even getting the approval process for our emergency operations plan, it started with our liaisons. We had some FEMA staff that had come out initially when we were first starting out this emergency management department, and they had helped us build out our initial emergency operations plan while it was in draft form. But from there, it had to go to our tribal council. They had to basically approve it. So that was written through a resolution, and Jeff had touched on this as well. Getting your interdepartmental folks involved. So as after we had gotten the emergency operations plan approved through the council, one of the resolutions that came as a result of that was forming an intertribal departmental working group. So we called it the Tribal Emergency Response Task Force. So this may help others down the road. You may want to start determining who within your tribal organization will help out in the event of an incident or disaster, who can fill in different incident command system ICS roles. Somebody who, like, say, Public Works, they may be able to help with logistical aspects of things, clearing debris, things like that. Your finance department, they're going to be really critical in the finance and admin piece. But yeah, that pre-planning is very critical and plays a big role before you go ahead in requesting a major disaster declaration.
So I think at this point, we're going to open it up for for the big question and answer session, right, Robert?
Oh, hey, Robert, you're on mute.
Okay, got it. That'll work, Jeff. And if your question is related to this specific section, please go ahead and ask that question. But yes, it is open. So let's proceed. Q&A.
So folks, just a quick reminder, you are more than welcome to continue putting your questions in the chat. At this portion of the Q&A, we'd also accept people who raise their hands as well. So we have a couple of questions lined up that we've received in the chat, and we'll start going through those. But if you'd like to ask your question live, I know sometimes it's hard to get everything put in just a little chat box, go ahead and use the raise hand function. You should be able to see that on the bottom of your Zoom screen if you'd like to ask a question live, and then our events team can work with you to unmute you for your question. One of the questions that we have in here, and I know Theresa did a great job following up, but I do think it's worth saying for this entire panel. There was a question that asked, what would you recommend as first steps for disaster planning for small tribes that do not have an emergency management department, i.e. what documents do we need most immediately? Who should we be working with? What resources can help us in this process? I think COVID-19 has really showcased, the necessity of emergency management departments and emergency management plans for tribal nations across the country. For a lot of tribal nations, COVID-19 was the first time that they may have ever worked with FEMA. And we know that, there's only a small percentage of tribal nations that have been able to access those resources from FEMA. I believe it's around 7% of all of Indian country. And so 7% of 574 tribes is pretty small in terms of working with FEMA directly. And then in terms of subrecipients, I believe it's another 7% as well. But turning to those on the panel, you all were likely at the same exact position. I know Nelson for sure was at the same position of, how do you walk into your tribal nation and just start working on building an emergency management department? Who do you need to talk to? What are the resources available? How would you recommend somebody or a tribal nation starting this process?
Yeah, I mean, I can just jump right in, I guess, and give some insight. So for us, initially just starting the department itself, it all started with the planning. We also, so when I came on board, we didn't have any resources. There wasn't a tribal vehicle, anything like that. So we had to get approval from our tribal leadership to even go ahead and form an emergency management department. So the way I did that was I brought in some of our old counterparts with FEMA. I brought in a federal coordinating officer from FEMA. I brought in the regional administrator from FEMA to address our tribal council, to address our chairman, our vice chair, and our secretary, basically to explain to them how important emergency management was. And then we started doing trainings, incident command system trainings, ICS, 700, 800, all the basics, basically, to explain the importance of what it is to have an emergency management department and what it is exactly, to operate under those four pillars, under the, the preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation aspects, and what that even meant. From there, it basically tied into the funding. How are we going to pay for this, right? How are you going to even pay yourself and have a position that's, coming out of, different funding, say, than the tribes, because we didn't have the funding, to pay for that position. So I had to apply for state grants. There's some grants that you can apply for that are pretty automatic. The Department of Public Health will have some grants for basically public health emergency preparedness FEP funding. Those were our initial funding, and then we had to go after big funding. The Tribal Homeland Security Grant Program. It's going to take a lot. You're going to have to start writing or learning how to write, or have somebody in your staff that can write the grants. But also then the planning. The planning is going to have to come into place, and that's where those relationships that Jeff and Norma were talking about with your regional liaisons will come into play, basically to help you get those plans initiated and started. So basically the explanation and the presentation to your council to even get approval to go ahead with to forming a department, finding different ways to get resources, through grant funding, and getting your plans initiated. There's also a lot of different avenues which we started off with to get funding and to get resources rather. The Indian Health Service has a program called Project Transam. Through there, you're able to get. So we've gotten vehicles, generators, tents, a lot of things that you're going to need to get started. So yeah, there's those are the four main things of how to get started. It's not an easy process. We've been doing this with my tribe, starting from zero to where we're at. In about 6 years it took us to get to where we're at, but it can be done. Yeah.
I think for us, one of the things, I had very similar situation to Nelson, getting here and not having a whole lot. One of the things that we utilized was, because a lot of what we do is very plan-based, we utilized EMAP, the Emergency Management Accreditation Program, they have a set of standards. And we began kind of looking at those standards and building our plans, and getting people asking the questions from different departments, and building it off of those standards, knowing that if we can meet those standards, then we will have hopefully a better plan in the long run. And doing so got a lot of interest from other departments to assist, and so that's really just getting them to the table to have the conversation. That was one of the methods that we used.
Well, thank you so much, guys. If anybody else in the panel would like to offer comments, feel free to jump in. One of the things I will very quickly mention for folks on the phone, before we end today's call, so after this Q&A section, I will take about 5 more minutes of your time to talk about NCAI's disaster preparedness grant that we have going on. And all you have to be is a federally recognized tribe or a state recognized tribe. You don't have to be a member of NCAI. And that's about a $20,000 grant that we're getting out to Indian country pretty quickly. And that type of funding can be utilized, right, to hire a contractor to create your plan, to be able to start buying equipment for your tribe, to help with these, right? That's $20,000 isn't a ton, but it's a great way to help start, the first steps here. And it's not a federal grant. It's funding coming straight from NCAI. So I hope you will take advantage of that. And we'll have our events team put the application in the chat box, and it will also be, there's a link to it in the PowerPoint slides. So just wanted to mention that funding opportunity for those of you who are starting your emergency management programs. That's a great opportunity for you to get some, off the bat funding out the door very quickly here in the next couple of weeks to help your tribal nation on this process. In terms of other questions that we have, I don't see any hands raised. So just a reminder for folks, if you want to ask a question, if you're calling in on a phone, you can press *6 and that will unmute your line, and then we'll have you ask a question. You can also use the raise hand function as well, and we can unmute your line. In terms of other questions in the chat box, I'm seeing some really fantastic work that our presenters are doing. So kudos to all of our presenters for not only presenting here today, but they're looking at people's questions in the chat and immediately putting resources. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the chat box today, I would check that out. But I do want to ask a question that somebody had put in here for Nelson, specifically that the question is, Nelson, that you mentioned that your tribal nation is part of a tribal EMAC. Can you provide some more information about this? So Nelson, I'll turn it over to you for an explanation on EMACs.
Sure. So as we had started off this presentation, we talked about the Stafford Act. So within the Stafford Act, states, that's why it's mainly state-centric. States get to utilize, the Emergency Mutual Aid Compact Agreement, and where there's funding, right, for state-to-state assistance, rendered after the result of a disaster or impact, things of that nature. Tribes, we don't have that, right? So the TMAC was a mechanism formed through the United South and Eastern Tribes. USET, we had, put these agreements in place, so tribes could offer mutual aid assistance to each other. So for the USET tribes, initially when I first started, joined USET, we all had filled out the the agreement for the TMAC, and if there was an incident, we would support each other, following an incident. We haven't actually used that until this past summer, during COVID. We were able to assist our sister tribe, the Aquina over at Montage Vineyard, with resources under the umbrella of the TMAC. So the way that our TMAC is structured was basically, a tribe can offer to repay, for those services, or they can just do it, basically out of an assistance. So there's no federal funding that's tied to this. There was funding initially for this through USET, through FEMA grant funding, but it was I believe a 3-year grant. So after that expired, there was no funding behind it. This all ties back to what we need as our own act for tribes to have direct funding, in funding to assist each other during incidents. So basically what we used was our own version of the EMAC, and it's not a federally funded it's not a federally funded mutual aid agreement, but it's a mechanism.
Nelson, I will add, NCAI, for those of you that haven't worked with NCAI before, it is truly a Congress of tribal nations, and we pass resolutions. And my job as a policy counsel are to take those resolutions and, show the will of Indian country and really work on those resolutions and help get things passed. Establishing a tribal emergency management compact is something that NCAI has a resolution on, that we continue to advocate on with several tribal nations, and we think is really important, right? Because we see it across Indian country all the time. I think a great example when I first arrived at NCAI was there was a hurricane on the East Coast, and Eastern Bay and Cherokee was impacted, and Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma automatically sent resources and coordinated their emergency teams. Tribes want to work with each other. Tribes want to help each other. It's just a question of, will there be federal funding to help support those efforts? Because tribals are already doing the work. It's just making sure that there's resources going to those efforts, so there's more tribal help up front. For the next question that we have coming in, for those who, I know this webinar will be recorded, so there are some folks that are watching this that maybe aren't able to access the chat, so I think it is important to bring up a couple of these questions that have been answered in the chat. There's a question about, is there a guide/cheat sheet, either from FEMA or somewhere, that has categories of disasters and plans or resources, i.e. in case there's a fire, you should have X, Y, and Z. In case there's an oil spill, you should have X, Y, and Z. Where would they find that information? And I know a couple of you have put great resources, but just for those who are just going to be watching this recording later, could you talk about those resources so folks watching it later could find them?
I think Dave put up the comprehensive emergency, the CEPG 1, right, Dave? For
I did, yeah. Kelby, you also saw the stuff going on behind, so I sent Brian a quick note like, hey, let's get together, have a phone call, and we'll make sure we address this better tomorrow. So I wasn't trying to punt on answering his question, but the basic categories are outlined in several documents that FEMA has. But the one thing I think Norma really hit this, and I think all of the panelists did, is when there's a disaster, you need to make us know when there's a disaster, and disasters are different. If you can consider a small tribe, with 25 homes in Southern California and they lose 18 or 20 of them, well, that's a disaster to them. It might not be to the federal government, it might not be to San Diego County, but it sure as heck is for that tribe. So yeah, we categorize things. FEMA regional staff will help you with those. Norma used to know them by heart, but she just shared today that she forgot them already, so she's enjoying her retirement. So I'll make sure we work with Brian, and we'll put something together to make sure we more clearly address that tomorrow. But yeah, in CPG 101, it's clear. In NFPA 1600, which Jeff mentioned for the emergency management accreditation program, those standards are there, and there's a gazillion templates. One of the first things I did when I went to work for the Morongo Band of Mission Indians in Southern California was I went to the Northwest Tribal Emergency Management Council, and I stole all their templates and called all those folks up there in the Northwest, because I was coming from a city and I didn't, I still know this much about, Indian country emergency management, but that was really helpful for me. So there's people out there willing to help, and Brian will definitely connect. And I think, I know Brian's with Arizona Intertribal, so we'll make sure that we loop in the right folks from FEMA Region 9 with to answer that question directly, but we'll get more tomorrow.
So actually, also, if you've got a copy of the Tribal Declaration Pilot Guidance, January 2017, if I haven't forgotten, if you look at page 20 in that document, you'll see a list of the kind of what plans are needed for if you're going to come tribal, if you're going to come direct or subrecipient. So that kind of outlines what's the plans you will need in either direct or subrecipient. And it's page 20.
Thank you so much, Norma. If anybody else in the panel would like to jump in on that question, please feel free to cut me off and add. And if not, I'm going to move on. Since we just have a couple more minutes, I want to make sure that we get as many questions as we can here. So there was a question earlier about how someone was going to apply for public assistance for Hurricane Laura, but during the process, they discovered that their tribe had no plan in place for overtime work. Does anyone have a pre-disaster written labor policy or guidance that they would be willing to share with tribal nations, since they're currently developing developing that. I know that Norma talked about how earlier that your tribal regional liaison should be able to help you with those plans. And sometimes there are tribal nations that have already said, you know, you're welcome to share our plan that we have. And I'll, you know, as I said earlier, I'm happy to send out a follow-up email from this webinar to everybody that registered for it, and the information that our panelists are willing to share, like Nelson and I think Jeff have also, you know, graciously said that they're happy to share some fantastic information as well. We'll make sure that it gets out there, but you know, is there anything else that needs to be added for that particular question about the overtime work portion of your plan for public assistance?
So we've run into this same issue. We did not necessarily develop a disaster specific overtime policy, but basically we utilized the nation's pay policy, just the employment pay policy that HR has, and in that it described how overtime is paid, if it's paid, to, you know, whom it's paid, but it was not specific to a disaster, and that was something that FEMA was able to work with, that policy, just because it defined your overtime, and so even though it may not be disaster specific, if you've got that policy in your HR policy.
We uploaded it into the FEMA grants portal as well. It was just our tribe's pay policy that that touched on everything to do with overtime and everything needed.
So go
sorry.
ahead, Theresa.
I was
Go
just
ahead.
going to say, I think too, in those HR policies, depending on, how big your tribe is and how many departments and programs you run and whether or not those are federally grant funded. I think in those policies too, to have a real clear statement about overtime, right? Because if they're grant funded and you're working in that position, maybe for housing, and then you're doing overtime because of a response, it might not be covered through your grant. So like just being clear about that and delineating like where it stops and where maybe tribal resources alone are going to pick up those costs, so that it's easier to track and then get reimbursed from. The other option too is to have in your policy some sort of statement. Most people write up their job descriptions like and other duties as assigned, which is really vague and broad for HR. But you can also put a clause like cities and counties and states do, that certain positions and roles would automatically convert to like disaster service work. And then that could even be built into your workers' comp and your liability insurance policies and programs, that when certain things happen, because we know historically they reoccur, like your workers are going to be converted to this. And then you can get new information from your liability and workers' comp as to like what those costs might be. And again, it's like getting into the weeds, but some of those things could maybe head off problems later on with reimbursements. And I've seen tribes do that before.
So I'm going to add two quick additional questions, unless Robert would like to cut in with any of the questions that he's seeing. The first one I'm going to direct to Norma, and I think this has been answered before, but I think it's important to reiterate. At what point do tribal nations need to start communicating with FEMA for disaster assistance? I know that we've continued to talk about the importance of developing those staff relationships within your FEMA region and FEMA HQ and your leadership relationships. As a former tribal liaison at FEMA Region 6, when would you recommend that tribal nation start having those relationships to prepare for disasters?
As soon as possible. For sure, if there's an event coming like for hurricanes, there is a window, of time where everybody's preparing the FEMA and the states and the tribes. So at that point, you reach out to your tribal liaison, identify any unmet needs at that point. And they can assist you try to find some of those unmet needs. Once the event occurs, then again, if the tribal liaison doesn't reach out to you, reach out to them and identify your unmet needs and what your situation is. So then they can again start assisting you in finding some of those resources. Mm. So really, but the best thing is to develop a relationship way before any event. But for sure, before, it's a hurricane coming before that hits, start talking to them. Once that event occurs, then for sure call them and let them know your situation, so they can then start talking in terms of what are the resources you need, get those for you, and then start discussing you're going direct, a subrecipient, and those type of things. And I apologize for my voice. My allergies are really bad today.
You're fine, Norma.
If I could just step in for a second, in regard to relationships, not only with jurisdictional relationships but also the federal entities out there. There was a question previously about VOADs, volunteer organizations assisting disasters. That it's not it's a good thing to reach out to some of those folks, including, probably the biggest one out there, or the largest one, most famous, is American Red Cross. A few years ago, NCAI worked with setting up a cooperative agreement with the American Red Cross into how they would improve the relationships with tribes. Sometimes there was not the best of relationships. They're pervasive, they're everywhere, and sometimes it goes to the nature of who those individuals are, but nevertheless they had worked on it. But there are also other entities out there, and if anybody on our panel wants to talk about some of those relationships, volunteer organizations, please do so.
I'll just add a little bit. We started off with our relationships with not just the Red Cross but Salvation Army, and especially during this pandemic, these relationships proved to be very important. We were able to deliver a lot of resources, not just to our tribe but to our sister tribe as well, by utilizing, say, the Red Cross to help deliver the items that the Salvation Army would provide, food boxes and things of those natures. There's also MOUs that you can establish with these voluntary organizations. But I also wanted to add, it's the relationships you have, say, if you do have that with your counties, is very critical as well, because your county counterparts and also your state counterparts are, that's where a lot of these other relationships are going to stem from. So that we had MOUs within the county, and that helped us with moving forward with our VOAD relationships.
I would just add, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I would just add to Intertribal Long-Term Recovery Foundation formed really from a local community assistance model, in part because when a regional recovery relief fund was established in our county, and when tribal representatives went to those meetings to seek access to the funding for their membership and for their individual tribal recovery, they were told, well, isn't there a separate fund for tribes? And we found like the lack of awareness about tribal homelands within the county and adjacent to these cities was so stark, and there was such a big gap that we needed to form our own nonprofit to have a voice at the table, to be able to fundraise separately, but then also to be reminded that we should already be included, right? Like our territories are within the same areas, right? And the disaster didn't know any boundaries, right? Didn't know it was going from tribal lands to a city or a county lands. And so that's kind of how we started. So I completely agree that looking at your local volunteer organizations and setting up relationships and meetings, most of those organizations, they really do want to work with all sectors of the community. And when we do fundraising or outreach, I'm always reminding these agencies and organizations about giving them cultural awareness and understanding about tribal history and jurisdiction and sovereignty and what that means. And a little goes a long way. You often have to repeat that because positions change, people move on. So it always feels like you're in that constant cycle of re-education, but it is really worth it because you can use them in big disaster times, but also with smaller individual, like single house fires or, an incident where someone in your community needs help. Some cities, I don't know if all cities have access to 211. It's sort of also a local regional, it'll vary by state or city by city. Numbers you can call to access information about all kinds of assistance available in your area. And in San Diego County, we've worked with 211 to identify tribal organizations that are nonprofits and that can help with sheltering, food, healthcare, mental health, a variety of different needs. So I put a link to the national VOAD with some of the, and it has a list of all the profile members. So.
Robert, we have an individual with their hand raised. Pat Arnold. Arnold, would it be okay to unmute their line to have them ask their question?
Absolutely.
All right, Pat, we are sending you a request to unmute, and looks like you are unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. First, I want to say hello, Robert. I met him many years ago after Katrina. I'm with the state of Louisiana. I work with the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs. I also worked with the Homeland Security. And I want to thank Norma as well. Y'all talking about relationships, and I'm not familiar with any of the other states, but I know here in Louisiana, Indian Affairs has a good relationship with our State Office of Emergency Preparedness. And we have worked together, Norma, myself, and GOSEP, as it's called, to help with the tribes, even though they go as a recipient and those who go as a subrecipient. So they work closely to assist if they have any questions or help them with any areas that they may need assistance with. And I know that given this past year's many hurricanes we had, we were able to assist them, and even with COVID, with getting out information and actually being able to set up with PPEs and all that type of stuff. So like I said before, I don't know how other states work, but I know with Ms. Norma over the past, seems like 50 years, I know it's not that long, Norma, but anyway, we have had a good relationship, and it does assist. And I would encourage you, here we have relationships with the parishes. Y'all have counties, we have parishes, but at least to reach out and let them know. Some people, and I know the situation, some of them just don't want to act with you, but it's important to build a relationship in all areas, especially, when we've been faced with all kind of issues. And I just want to say thank you, Ms. Kelby, for allowing me to be on this. And again, Robert, it's been many years, and I thank you for your support during Hurricane Katrina. And then Norma, thank you for all your support, and I do hope that you have a fantastic retirement, but don't do like I did, retire and come back.
Hi, Pat. Great to hear from you. So I agree with Pat. Let me tell you, during COVID, it was crazy. However, whatever there were anything in terms of coordinating with the state of Louisiana, Pat was there. She was a great asset, and we have a great working relationship. And she's continuing that relationship with the tribal liaisons that are there as well now. So definitely it was. It was a wonderful state-federal working relationship. Take care.
I do want to exercise some executive discretion and say it's good to hear from you, Pat. And you did some wonderful work there in Louisiana with the tribes, and as well as nationally. I know you were like nationally with some tribes, and it's good to hear from you. And thank you so much for emphasizing that to begin those discussions and those relationship building today, and now's the time to do it. Thank you.
Robert, if folks are okay with it, I know we only have about 4 minutes left. I'd like to take at least 2 of those minutes very quickly to showcase the NCAI Disaster Preparedness Grant. I would ask our events team if they could please put the application on in the chat again. And then if you're watching this later, you can find the application on ncai.org, searching for Disaster Preparedness Grant. Just really wanted to quickly, give folks a heads up about this opportunity that NCAI has put together for a lot of tribal nations. So we have a chunk of funding that we are trying to get out the door for tribal nations to start preparing for future disasters. The cap on the grant amount is $20,000. And as I said earlier, it doesn't, it's not a ton of money, but it's enough to, purchase necessary equipment that your tribe might need, to, hire a contractor to start developing these plans, hire some experts to start getting your ducks in a row to assist you in starting up that emergency management program, or help build out the program that you're already working on. The application has to be forward-looking, so you can't, for example, I saw a question about Hurricane Laura. You can't apply for, cleanup from Hurricane Laura. Let's say, for example, you have some power that was taken out during Hurricane Laura and you want to fix that. What you could do, for example, is buy generators and start using them now. You don't have to wait till the next hurricane hits. And so, thinking in that mindset of, if you're going to buy equipment with this particular grant, just write your application in a way that it's for a future disaster. And then you can start, as soon as you need to buy that truck for, the truck for your department or piece of equipment for your department, you can start using it now and, use it for future disasters. The funds do have to be obligated within 6 months. There's a link to the application. The application is fairly simple. It's basically an application that showcases, what are you using the money for? What's your budget justification? So it's pretty quick and simple. You just kind of have to have in your mindset what you want to actually use the funding for. And then there will be a request for you to submit a summary report by June 1st. You can submit your applications to Kiana Proctor, and those applications, as I said, should be getting in by February 28th. And our events team should be putting in a copy of the grant application into the chat box. And there's also a link to the grant application in the PDF. Also, if you just search NCAI Disaster Preparedness Grant on Google, that should take you to our NCAI grant page, and you can easily find this application on that grant page as well. So the last thing I'll highlight is you just need to be you have to be a federally recognized tribe or a state recognized tribe. You do not have to be a member of NCAI. So we do know that there are some tribal nations out there that definitely need help in building their emergency management preparedness, but they might not be a member of NCAI. Not a problem. You can still apply for the grant, but it has to be on behalf of the tribal nation. It's not funding that goes to an individual. It has to be for your tribal nation. With all that being said, Robert, I'm going to turn it back over to you for our final comments. I know that we've just got a few moments left, but just want to take a couple of seconds to thank everybody on the webinar today. Thank you for taking your time to spend with us today. We know this is a lot of information, but appreciate you being here. And thank you to the folks watching afterwards. We know that this is a pretty, the webinar is very much anticipated, and we expect a lot of people to rewatch it. And we hope that you use this information to help prepare your nations going forward. And we hope that it's very useful to you. Finally, I just want to thank all of our presenters and especially Robert Holden, who did a fantastic job setting all of this up. And thank you to our event staff. And a reminder that we are going to have another one of these tomorrow. It is different content. So don't just think, I've got part one done, I'm out. It's all 3 webinars will be different content. And I probably stole some of the things Robert was going to say. So I will quit going on and turn it over to Mr. Holden. Robert?
Thank you, Kelby. At least you can say it much better than me. So don't feel bad about that. Yeah, we will be covering parts 7 through 11 tomorrow. Sounds hot. Okay, tomorrow starting again at 12:30. I want to thank our presenters. They're just wonderful. I mean, I just can't say enough that how fortunate I am to work with a cadre of Native people who are professional and non-Native as well, who have their hearts in the right place and are doing some great things. And I will also say this, that, I saw a comment or a question about how do I begin? Where do I start? And the first thing that came to mind is you're doing the right thing, you're asking. And that's what it takes. There's not any of these presenters who would not respond and reply because they've been in that same place. We've all been in that same place in terms of trying to learn the next step, trying to learn more in helping our communities. So submit your questions and we'll continue this effort. It's not a one and done, even though we may finish up with this webinar and this series even, that we're all in this together. We come from the same place and we'll get to where we're going by working together. So with that, I'm going to ask if Honorable Joe Garcia is still on the line, if you would close us out for the day, please.
So apologies, Robert. I guess he might have had to step away for that council meeting. So I think he stayed on with us and hasn't been able to unmute. So I think if you're okay with it, Robert, we'll close out today and then we'll ask the councilman to open us up in a good way tomorrow as well. And yakulke for everybody for being here. Robert?
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.